It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Beatrice Vance laughed as she poured cold tea over Julianne Vance's blouse in front of the entire garden party. The liquid was tepid, but the sting was sharp, a dark amber stain spreading across the cheap cotton fabric like an inkblot test of Julian's patience. Around them, the clink of silver spoons against fine bone china stopped abruptly. The air, heavy with the scent of expensive jasmine and blooming peonies, seemed to freeze as 30 pairs of eyes drifted toward the spectacle. "Oh, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice a melodious trill that carried perfectly to the edge of the manicured lawn. She didn't look remorseful, she looked invigorated. "I suppose that's what happens when you buy off the rack. The fabric just attracts accidents. Perhaps next time you'll consider something with a bit more substance, though I doubt your little computer job provides the budget for it." Julian didn't flinch. She felt the dampness seeping through her camisole, the sticky sweetness of the Earl Grey clinging to her skin. She reached for a linen napkin, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at her mother, the woman who had spent the last decade treating her like a stain on the family's pristine reputation. Instead, she looked at the white-clothed table, where a single drop of tea had missed her and landed on a pristine invitation to the Vance anniversary gala. "It's fine, Beatrice," Julian said quietly. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the performative cruelty radiating from the woman in the Chanel suit. "It's mother to you, if you can remember your manners for 5 minutes," Leo Vance interjected, stepping forward with a smirk that matched his mother's. He adjusted his gold Rolex, making sure the sunlight caught the diamonds on the bezel. "But then again, manners are for people who actually contribute to this family. How's the IT desk, Jules? Still resetting passwords for people who actually do important work." Leo's laugh was a harsh, barking sound that encouraged a few of the guests to join in. To them, Julian was the broken Vance, the one who had refused the socialite path, the one who lived in a modest apartment on the wrong side of the city, and the one who supposedly lacked the ambition to maintain the family's high-octane lifestyle. Sienna Vance leaned in from the side, her smartphone already raised. The light glinted off the lens as she framed the shot. "Don't look so glum, Jules. This is great for my day in the life series. When your sister forgets how to dress for a garden party. It's very relatable, very underdog of you." Julian finally looked up. She met Sienna's gaze through the screen, then shifted her eyes to Leo and finally Beatrice. They were a tableau of arrogance, framed by the white marble pillars of the estate and the rolling green hills that the Vance family had called their own for generations. They felt safe. They felt untouchable. "I think I'll go inside and clean up," Julian said, her voice barely a whisper. "Do that," Beatrice snapped, turning back to her circle of friends as if Julian had already ceased to exist. "And try not to drip on the Persian rugs. They cost more than your annual salary, I'm sure." Julian turned and walked toward the house. As she crossed the threshold into the cool, shadowed foyer, the sound of the party faded into a distant hum. The scent of jasmine was replaced by the smell of old wood and beeswax. She didn't head for the laundry room or the guest bathroom. Instead, she reached into the hidden pocket of her damp skirt and pulled out a sleek, black device that looked like a standard smartphone, but felt significantly heavier. She tapped the screen. A series of encrypted lines scrolled past in a blur of neon green before settling into a dashboard that would have made a hedge fund manager weep. In the center of the screen, a notification blinked. Acquisition finalized. 100% ownership secured. Julian leaned against the mahogany wainscoting, her thumb hovering over the glass. She thought about the way Leo had bragged about his new dealership expansion, unaware that the land it sat on had just changed hands. She thought about Beatrice's unlimited credit line, which was currently being fueled by a trust fund that Julian's firm had quietly restructured 3 months ago. Her phone vibrated. A message from Marcus Thorne appeared. "The papers are ready for the gala, Julian. They have no idea the lion is already in the room. Shall we proceed with the audit on the estate accounts?" Julian looked at the tea stain on her chest. It was a badge of their entitlement, a physical manifestation of the contempt they had nurtured for years. They saw a girl who fixed computers. They didn't see the woman who had built a cybersecurity empire under a pseudonym, a woman who now held the keys to every vault they considered their birthright. She heard Leo's voice drifting in from the garden, boasting about a car he hadn't actually paid for yet. "Not yet, Marcus," she whispered to the empty foyer, her fingers flying across the screen. "Let them enjoy the party. I want them to be at their absolute peak when the floor disappears." She tucked the phone away and straightened her shoulders. She didn't need to change her blouse. She wanted them to see the stain. She wanted them to remember this moment, the moment they thought they had won. Because in 3 days, at the anniversary gala, the name Vance wouldn't belong to the people in the garden anymore. It would belong to her. Julian stepped back out onto the terrace, a small, cold smile playing on her lips as she watched Beatrice raise a glass of champagne to a crowd of people who were about to become very, very well acquainted with the truth. The countdown had begun, and the first card had already been played. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance breakfast room, illuminating the thin layer of dust Beatrice Vance chose to ignore. The air was thick with the suffocating, floral scent of lilies, Beatrice's favorite, and a smell Julian had come to associate with impending disaster. "Julian, darling, stop moving your eggs around and listen," Beatrice said, the rhythmic scritch-scritch of her gold-plated pen against a legal pad cutting through the silence. She didn't look up, her focus entirely on the list of expenses for the upcoming gala. "We've had a slight adjustment in the family's liquid assets. Leo's new dealership venture required a larger down payment than anticipated." Julian took a slow sip of her bitter, over-roasted espresso. She didn't blink. "And how does that affect me, Mother?" Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes cold and calculating. "We're selling the lake cottage, and since your name is still technically on the deed from your father's misguided will, I need you to sign the transfer papers by noon. Also, I'll need you to redirect your salary this month to the estate account. It's a small sacrifice for the family name." The audacity was a physical weight in the room. That cottage was the only place Julian felt she still had a connection to her father, and her salary, the pittance Beatrice mocked, was supposedly Julian's only means of survival. "The cottage is worth 3 times what Leo needs for that dealership," Julian said, her voice a calm, level contrast to the internal fire blooming in her chest. "It's about liquidity, Julian. Don't be difficult," Beatrice snapped, waving a manicured hand as if dismissing a fly. "People like us don't worry about worth. We worry about appearance. And right now, Leo appearing successful is more important than your sentimental attachment to a drafty shack." The sound of heavy footsteps preceded Leo Vance as he sauntered into the room, looking far too smug for a man who had spent the previous night bragging about a car he didn't own. He dropped a silver laptop onto the linen tablecloth with a heavy thud. "Speaking of your little job, Jules," Leo said, a jagged smirk twisting his face. "I borrowed your laptop this morning. Tried to fix that sluggish processor of yours, but you've got more firewalls than a government black site. What are you hiding? Pictures of cats and your sad bank balance." Julian felt a surge of adrenaline. She reached out, her fingers brushing the slight, oily residue Leo's fingers had left on the sleek casing of her tablet. He had no idea that the moment he'd tried to bypass her encryption, he'd triggered a silent backtrace. He hadn't just failed to get in. He'd given her his IP address and his personal cloud credentials in his clumsy attempt to fix her. "I prefer my privacy, Leo," she said softly. "Privacy is for people with something to lose," he laughed, reaching for a piece of dry toast. "By the way, I saw a notification pop up before the screen locked. Something about a Project Zenith ledger. Sounds awfully fancy for a mid-level coder." Beatrice froze for a fraction of a second, her pen hovering over the paper. "Zenith, that's a common term, Leo. Don't pester her with business talk she wouldn't understand." Julian caught the flicker of panic in her mother's eyes. Beatrice thought Project Zenith was her private, offshore escape hatch, the account she'd been using to siphon what was left of the Vance trust. What Beatrice didn't know was that Julian had built the architecture for the firm that managed that account. Julian wasn't just a coder, she was the ghost in the machine. "You're right, Leo," Julian said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "It's probably nothing you need to worry about. Just like you don't need to worry about the financing for your dealership." "I've already got the funding," Leo bragged, puffing out his chest. "A private equity group called Thorne and Associates. They saw my potential immediately." Julian turned toward the door to hide her smile. Marcus Thorne had indeed seen Leo's potential, the potential to be the perfect fall guy. Marcus had spent the morning finalizing the paperwork that would make Julian the primary creditor for Leo's entire life. "I'm sure they did," Julian murmured. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the two people who had spent years treating her like a footstool. "The gala is in 48 hours, isn't it?" 2 days, Julian," Beatrice said, already back to her list. "Try to find something to wear that doesn't scream disappointed librarian. Arthur Sterling will be there, and I won't have you embarrassing the Vance name." Julian nodded, her hand resting on the phone in her pocket. She could feel the countdown ticking in her mind. "I'll make sure it's a night no one ever forgets." As she walked down the hall, she pulled out her phone and sent a 3-word text to Marcus Thorne: "Initiate the seizure." The following afternoon, the air inside the Atelier de Lyon was thick with the cloying scent of sandalwood and the hushed, reverent tones of high-fashion commerce. Julianne Vance stood near the velvet-draped changing rooms, her presence as inconspicuous as the shadows in the corner. She watched as a seamstress knelt before her mother, pinning the hem of a gown that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. Beatrice Vance surveyed her reflection in the triptych of mirrors, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she was looking down at the entire world. She smoothed the emerald silk over her hips, her eyes narrowing as they landed on her eldest daughter's reflection. "Don't just stand there like a gargoyle, Julian," she snapped, the words cutting through the boutique's quiet elegance. She gestured vaguely toward a rack of discounted clearance items near the back. "Go find something that doesn't make you look like you're attending a funeral for a cat. Arthur Sterling will be watching the Vance box closely tomorrow night, and I won't have your drabness dragging down our stock." The boutique manager, a man who smelled of expensive cigarettes and desperation, offered a thin, condescending smile. He didn't even look at Julian as he handed a glass of vintage champagne to Beatrice. He knew where the money was, or where he thought it was. "Of course, Mrs. Vance," the manager purred. "Perhaps your daughter would be more comfortable in the ready-to-wear section. We have some lovely linens from last season." Julian felt the familiar heat of a rage spike prickling at her scalp, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. She reached into her modest crossbody bag, her fingers brushing against the cold, heavy edge of a black titanium card Marcus had delivered to her apartment at dawn. It was the master key to the Thorne Sterling credit line, a weapon disguised as plastic. "Linens would be lovely," Julian said, her voice a calm, flat lake. "But I think I'll wait." The chime above the door rang, and the atmosphere shifted from stifling elegance to loud, oily arrogance. Leo Vance marched in, his designer suit a shade too bright and his smile a fraction too wide. He was carrying a box from a luxury watchmaker, swinging it with the casual disregard of a man who believed his credit was infinite. "There she is, the Queen Mother in her natural habitat," Leo shouted, ignoring the manager's flinch at his volume. He walked straight to Beatrice and kissed her cheek, then turned to Julian with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "Still wearing the same shoes from college, Jules? I'd offer to buy you a pair, but I just dropped 80 grand on the new Ferrari. Business at the dealership is exploding." He leaned in closer, the smell of his heavy cologne hitting Julian like a physical blow. "Marcus Thorne actually did something useful for once. He helped me secure the bridge loan for the new showroom. I'm the king of the strip now, sis. While you're scrubbing code for pennies, I'm building an empire." Julian watched him, noting the way his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. He didn't know. He had no idea that the bridge loan Marcus had facilitated was actually a debt trap mortgage, and that the primary creditor was a shell company Julian had incorporated 3 years ago. Every brick of his empire now sat on her desk. "I heard about the Ferrari, Leo," Julian said softly. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that forced him to lean in. "It's a beautiful car. It would be a shame if someone repossessed it before the gala." Leo laughed, a harsh, braying sound that drew the attention of the other high society patrons in the shop. "Repossess? From me? I'm a Vance, Julian. We don't get repossessed. We do the repossessing." He turned back to Beatrice, dismissively flicking a piece of lint toward Julian's shoulder. "Mother, tell her to stop being so morbid. It's a celebration. Tomorrow night the Vances take their rightful place at the top of the Sterling guest list." Beatrice sighed, inspecting her manicure. "She's just jealous, Leo. It's a common trait in those who lack ambition. Now help me decide on the lace." Julian stepped away, moving toward the front of the store. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a notification from the encrypted banking app Marcus had set up. "Asset transfer complete. Vance Motors HQ. Legal title, Mercer Holdings LLC." A slow, predatory satisfaction curled in her chest. Mercer was her grandmother's maiden name, the only Vance who had ever shown her a shred of kindness. Now, it was the name of the entity that owned Leo's livelihood. She caught the boutique manager's eye as she headed for the door. For the first time that day, she didn't look away. She held his gaze until he blinked, his professional mask flickering with a moment of genuine confusion at the sudden, sharp authority in her expression. "Tell the tailor to keep the emerald dress ready," Julian said to the manager, her voice carrying just enough to reach Beatrice and Leo. "But don't bother billing the Vance estate. The account is already flagged for insufficient funds." Beatrice froze, a pin halfway to her bodice. Leo's smirk faltered for a heartbeat before he recovered with a scoff. "Ignore her. She's lost her mind." Julian didn't stay to hear the rest. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, the crisp afternoon air hitting her face. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus. "Is everything in place for the gala?" she asked as she walked toward the subway, her pace steady and rhythmic. "The documents are in the vault, Julian," Marcus replied, his voice crackling with a professional edge. "Arthur Sterling has been briefed on the new majority shareholder of the Vance portfolio. He's looking forward to the introduction." "Good," she said, stopping at the top of the stairs to the station. She looked back at the boutique, her eyes cold. "Make sure the process servers are timed for the second toast. I want Leo to be holding a glass of champagne when he realizes he doesn't even own the shoes on his feet." 24 hours, Marcus said. 24 hours, Julian repeated. She tucked the phone away and descended into the city's heart. The blueprint was finished. The trap was set. All that remained was to watch them walk into it. The morning before the gala, the air in the Vance estate was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive floor wax. Julianne Vance sat in the sunroom, the cold, metallic click of her laptop closing echoing against the marble floors. She watched the dust motes dance in the light, her expression as unreadable as the encrypted files she had just sent to Marcus Thorne. Leo Vance strode into the room, his presence announced by the sharp, rhythmic strike of his Italian leather loafers. He was already wearing his tuxedo trousers and a crisp white shirt, the fabric rustling with every arrogant movement. He stopped in front of a gilded mirror, adjusting his collar with the practiced vanity of a man who believed the world existed solely to admire him. "Make yourself useful, Jules," he said, his voice echoing with a casual, cutting entitlement. He didn't look at her, focusing instead on his own reflection. "The catering staff is complaining about the kitchen layout. Go down there and sort it out. I don't want any friction when the VIPs arrive tomorrow." Julian didn't move. She leaned back in the velvet chair, her fingers grazing the edge of a thick manila folder hidden beneath her tablet. "The staff is professional, Leo. They don't need me to hold their hands. Perhaps you should focus on your speech. It would be a shame if you stumbled over your words in front of Arthur Sterling." Leo laughed, a short, barking sound that held no genuine humor. He finally turned, his eyes raking over her modest attire with visible disdain. "Arthur Sterling is coming to see a visionary, not a tech support girl. I've already secured the bridge loan for the dealership expansion. Tomorrow isn't just a party, it's the coronation of the Vance legacy. My legacy. He stepped closer, invading her personal space to reach for a silver tray of crystal water glasses. The scent of his heavy, musky cologne, the kind that cost more than a month's rent for most people, filled the space between them. I've decided what to do with your wing of the house, by the way. Once the Sterling deal is finalized, I'm converting your suite into a private cigar lounge. You can move into the guest cottage, or better yet, find a little apartment closer to whatever server room you haunt. You're very confident about a deal that hasn't been signed, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the twitch in his jaw. You might want to read the Sterling contract one last time, Leo. The clauses regarding beneficial ownership are quite specific. It would be a tragedy if you miscalculated who actually holds the cards. He sneered, leaning down until he was eye level with her. I have lawyers for that, Jules. Real ones. Not whatever bargain bin legal aid you consult. You've always been jealous because Dad left the keys to the kingdom to the son who actually knows how to lead. You're just a ghost in this house. Tomorrow, I'm finally exorcising you. At that moment, Sienna Vance fluttered into the room, her phone mounted on a sleek stabilizer. She was already in full makeup, her skin glowing with an artificial, camera-ready sheen. She didn't even acknowledge Julian's presence, treating her sister like a piece of unwanted furniture. Leo, stop bullying the help and come look at the floral arrangements, Sienna chirped, her eyes fixed on her own screen. The influencers are already tagging the venue. We need to maintain the Vance Excellence brand. Jules, move your laptop. You're ruining the background of my shot. Julian stood up slowly, tucking the manila folder under her arm. She felt the weight of the documents, the signed transfer of the Vance portfolio, the legal proof of her majority stake, and the debt recalls Marcus had prepared. She looked at her brother, who was already turning back to the mirror, and her sister, who was preening for a digital audience of strangers. You're right, Sienna, Julian said, her voice dropping to a cold, crystalline whisper. The background is about to change significantly for everyone. Leo didn't even look back. He was too busy admiring the fit of his jacket. 24 hours, Jules. Try not to embarrass us before then. Julian walked out of the sunroom, her pace steady and deliberate. She reached the foyer and pulled out her phone, seeing a final confirmation text from Marcus. The trap was no longer a plan. It was a countdown. She looked up at the massive portrait of the Vance patriarch hanging in the hall and felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. The warning had been given. The arrogance had been documented. All that remained was the arrival of the evening that would strip them of everything they thought they owned. She climbed the stairs to her room, the silence of the house finally feeling like a victory. One more night of their delusions. Only one. The evening of the Sterling Foundation gala arrived with a clinical precision that mirrored Julian's own internal state. Exactly 24 hours had passed since she had stood in the sunroom, watching her brother admire his own reflection. And now, the setting had shifted to the ancestral ballroom of the Sterling estate. The air inside the grand hall was thick with the scent of Casablanca lilies, and the expensive, cloying perfumes of 500 guests who moved with the rehearsed grace of a predatory reef. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the room, draped in emerald silk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, her diamonds catching the light of the massive chandeliers with every practiced tilt of her head. Beside her, Leo moved through the crowd like a man who believed the floor had been polished specifically for his feet. He was busy cornering a local venture capitalist, his voice booming with the false bravado of a man who didn't realize his bank accounts were currently bleeding out in the dark. It's a pity about Julian, Beatrice said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the cluster of socialites surrounding her. She sighed, a delicate, performative sound. I offered to buy her something appropriate for tonight, a simple gown from the boutique, but she insisted she had everything she needed. I suppose some people are simply more comfortable in the shadows of their own mediocrity. A ripple of polite, cruel laughter followed her statement. Arthur Sterling, the evening's host and a man whose family name was synonymous with old-world power, stood a few feet away. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his eyes, sharp as flint, drifted toward Beatrice. He didn't join the laughter. Instead, he checked his watch, his expression unreadable. Sienna was nearby, her phone held aloft as she live-streamed the opulence to her followers. "The Vance family is officially in the building," she chirped into the lens, carefully framing Beatrice and Leo while ensuring the background showed the Sterling crest. "Tonight is about legacy. And speaking of legacy, has anyone seen my sister? She's probably hiding in the coat room trying to figure out which fork is for the salad." The double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The quartet didn't stop playing, but the collective volume of the room dipped by several decibels. Julian didn't scuttle in. She didn't look for a corner to disappear into. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet so dark it appeared black until the light hit the folds, revealing a shimmer of sapphire. It was a masterpiece of understated power. No visible labels, no gaudy sequins, just a silhouette that commanded the space it occupied. Her hair was swept back, exposing the steady, cool line of her jaw. As she stepped onto the marble floor, the sound of her heels wasn't a frantic click, but a deliberate, rhythmic strike that seemed to sync with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Leo was the first to notice. He froze mid-sentence, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "What is she wearing?" he hissed to Sienna, his arrogance momentarily flickering into confusion. "That's not the rag she had yesterday. She probably rented it," Sienna whispered back, though her eyes remained glued to the way the fabric moved. "Or it's a very good knockoff. Look at her, acting like she belongs here." Julian ignored them both. She moved through the crowd with a terrifyingly calm purpose, her gaze fixed on the podium where Arthur would soon give the keynote address. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her clutch, a small, silver rectangle that contained the digital death warrants of the Vance family's reputation. As she passed a waiter, she took a glass of sparkling water, her fingers steady. She caught the eye of Marcus Thorne, who was standing near the buffet. He gave her a single, imperceptible nod. The legal filings were ready. The ownership transfers were verified. The trap was no longer being set. The teeth were already beginning to close. Beatrice intercepted her before she could reach the VIP section. The matriarch's face was a mask of strained composure, her eyes scanning Julian's dress with the intensity of a jeweler looking for a flaw. "Julian," Beatrice said, her voice a low, dangerous warning. "I don't know where you stole that dress, but I suggest you find a corner and stay there. Arthur Sterling is about to speak, and I will not have you embarrassing this family with your delusions of grandeur." Julian took a slow sip of her water, looking at Beatrice over the rim of the glass. The smell of Beatrice's perfume, something heavy and floral, felt like a suffocating blanket, but Julian didn't flinch. "The only thing embarrassing this family, Beatrice, is the belief that you still own the ground you're standing on," Julian said. Her voice was a crystalline whisper, barely audible over the music, yet it carried a weight that made the older woman's hand tremble slightly. "How dare you?" Beatrice hissed, her face flushing a mottled red beneath her expensive foundation. "You are here by my grace. You live in my house. You eat my food." "Actually," Julian replied, her eyes drifting toward the podium where Arthur Sterling was now stepping up to the microphone, "it's been a long time since anything in that house belonged to you. You just haven't been served the notice yet." Leo stepped up behind his mother, his chest puffed out. "Enough of this, Jules. You're making a scene. Go to the car, now, before I have security escort you out for being a nuisance." Julian looked at Leo, then at Sienna, who had turned her camera toward the confrontation, sensing a viral moment of sibling rivalry. Julian didn't hide from the lens. She smiled, a thin, sharp expression that didn't reach her eyes. "You should keep that camera running, Sienna," Julian said calmly. "You're going to want to capture the exact moment the Vance name becomes a footnote in a bankruptcy filing." Arthur Sterling tapped the microphone. The room fell into a sudden, expectant silence. The high society witnesses, the bankers, the lawyers, the rivals, all turned their attention toward the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice echoing through the hall. "Tonight, we celebrate the future of the Sterling Foundation. But before we begin our planned program, I have a special announcement regarding a new partnership, one that will fundamentally change the landscape of our local industry." Julianne felt a surge of cold, quiet electricity. She didn't look at the podium. She looked at Beatrice and Leo. She watched the way they preened, leaning forward as if expecting Arthur to call their names, their faces filled with the unearned confidence of the doomed. "I would like to invite our primary benefactor and the new majority shareholder of the Vance Holdings to the stage," Arthur continued. Julianne set her glass down on a passing tray. She didn't wait for her name. She simply began to walk toward the stage, the midnight blue velvet of her dress whispering against the marble. Behind her, she heard the sharp, sudden intake of Beatrice's breath, a sound of dawning, horrific realization that was sweeter than any champagne in the room. The countdown was over. The gala had truly begun. The silence that followed the announcement was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone in the ballroom. Julianne ascended the 3 small steps to the podium, her movements measured and devoid of the frantic energy that usually defined these high-stakes events. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the man who had helped her orchestrate this symphony of consequences. Arthur Sterling stepped back, offering her the microphone with a respectful nod that felt like a coronation. To his left, Marcus Thorne stood with a tablet in hand, his thumb hovering over the final command. He caught her eye and gave a sharp, single nod. The trap was locked. Julianne took the microphone. The metal was cold against her palm, a stark contrast to the heat of the stage lights. She didn't start with a greeting. She didn't offer a smile. She simply looked toward the 3rd row of tables, where the family who had spent a lifetime trying to erase her sat in stunned, paralyzed silence. For years, the Vance name has stood for legacy, for stability, and for a specific kind of untouchable grace, she began, her voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. But as many of you in this room know, a name is only as strong as the foundation it's built on. And this foundation has been rotting for a very long time. She signaled to the back of the room. A low hum filled the air as the massive digital display behind her flickered to life. It didn't show the expected corporate logo or a promotional video of the Vance Holdings. Instead, a series of forensic audit reports, offshore wire transfers, and internal memos began to scroll. In the center, highlighted in a damning, glowing red, were the signatures that had authorized the systematic embezzlement of the family trust. Beatrice Vance looked as if she had been struck by an invisible hand. The color drained from her cheeks with violent speed, leaving her skin the shade of wet parchment. Her eyes bulged, fixed on the screen where her private bank records, the ones she thought were buried under layers of offshore encryption, were now being broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. Her mouth hung open, a silent O of ruin, while her hands clawed at the pearls around her neck as if they were suddenly choking her. The haughty tilt of her chin, her trademark for decades, collapsed into a stuttering, pathetic tremble that made her look small, old, and utterly broken. The room erupted in a wave of sharp intakes of breath. Sienna froze, her phone slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud, her influencer persona evaporating in the face of actual, uncurated disaster. Leo staggered back, his hand searching blindly for the support of a nearby table, his face a mask of sweating, panicked realization as he saw his own name listed on the secondary accounts. To the left, 2 senior board members who had spent the evening laughing at the matriarch's jokes suddenly took a synchronized step away from her, as if her failure were contagious. "The Vance Holdings didn't fail because of the market," Julianne continued, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a blade. "They failed because they were treated like a personal piggy bank by people who believed their birthright exempted them from the law. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I have personally acquired 92% of the outstanding debt. I am the sole owner of the Vance estate, the holdings, and the very ground you are standing on." The murmurs died instantly. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the faint, rhythmic clicking of the projector. Julian looked directly at her mother, seeing the woman for exactly what she was, a predator who had finally run out of prey. She didn't feel the surge of anger she had expected. She felt nothing but a cold, clinical sense of completion. "You spent years telling me I was a burden on the Vance name," she said, her words dropping like stones into a still pond. "It turns out I'm the only reason that name still has a cent to its credit. The locks on the estate were changed an hour ago. Your personal belongings will be delivered to a motel on the outskirts of town tomorrow morning. I suggest you find a way to pay for the second night." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch the security team, already moving in from the wings, approach the table. She handed the microphone back to Arthur, stepped off the stage, and walked toward the grand exit. Behind her, the first sounds of Beatrice's shrill, desperate protest began to rise, but Julian didn't turn back. She was already halfway to the door, the weight of 1,000 insults finally lifting from her shoulders. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy, a suffocating blanket that dampened the echoes of Julian's footsteps as she vanished through the arched mahogany doors. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The scent of expensive lilies and vintage champagne, which had felt like the aroma of victory only an hour ago, now seemed to hang in the air like funeral incense. Beatrice stood frozen by the podium, her fingers still curled around the edge of the wood as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The carefully curated mask of the Vance matriarch didn't just slip, it shattered. Her skin, usually a porcelain triumph of expensive serums and tactical lighting, turned a sickly, mottled gray. A fine tremor started at the corner of her mouth and spread until her entire jaw worked soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Her eyes, once sharp and predatory, went wide and glassy, darting frantically across the sea of faces that were no longer looking at her with envy, but with a burgeoning, hungry pity. Her chest heaved beneath the silk of her designer gown, the fabric straining as her breathing became shallow and jagged. "This is a joke," Beatrice finally rasped, the sound cracking like dry parchment. She looked toward the guests, her social circle, her kingdom. "Arthur, tell them this is some twisted performance art. Julian is a child she doesn't own." "She owns everything, Beatrice," Arthur Sterling interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the furthest corners of the room. He didn't look at her with his usual polished warmth. He looked at her as if she were a smudge on his cufflink. He stepped back, physically putting distance between himself and the woman he had toasted only minutes prior. "I've seen the filings. You've been living on her charity for 3 years without even knowing the name of the hand that fed you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sienna Vance, standing near the front, let her smartphone slip from her hand. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, plastic crack. She didn't reach for it. She just stared at the stage, her face pale, the realization of her own cruelty toward her sister finally beginning to settle in her eyes. Marcus Thorne stepped forward then, his leather briefcase clicking open with a sound like a guillotine blade dropping. He pulled a thick sheaf of documents from the interior pocket, the official gold seals of the state treasury catching the light. "The eviction is effective immediately," Marcus said, his tone as clinical as a surgeon's. "The locks on the main gates and the private quarters were cycled at 8:00 p.m. Security personnel are currently stationed at every exit. You will be permitted 10 minutes to retrieve your handbag. Everything else, the jewelry, the furs, the art, is currently tied up in the audit." "You can't do this," Leo Vance roared, finally finding his voice. He lunged toward the stage, his face a frantic, blotchy red. "That's my house. Those are my cars." He stopped abruptly as 2 large men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. Their presence alone was a physical wall. Leo stumbled back, his bravado evaporating as he looked around the room for an ally. He found none. The board members he'd spent the evening impressing were suddenly very interested in the exits. "Your cars were leased through a shell company funded by your sister's dividends, Leo," Marcus noted, not even looking up from his papers. "The leases were terminated an hour ago. I suggest you call a rideshare, though given your credit rating, you might want to ask a friend for the fare. The humiliation was visceral. It had a weight and a smell, the metallic tang of sweat and the sharp, ozone sting of a collapsing ego. Beatrice tried to descend the stairs with her dignity intact, but her knees buckled on the third step. She had to grab the railing, her manicured nails screeching against the polished wood. The guests began to move then, but not toward her. It was a mass exodus, a silent, synchronized retreat. The very people who had laughed at her jokes about Julian's shabby appearance were now whispering behind their hands, their eyes cold. I always thought there was something off about the books, one board member muttered to another as they hurried toward the coat check. Did you see her face? A socialite whispered, her voice dripping with malicious glee. The Queen doesn't even have a bed to sleep in tonight. Beatrice reached the bottom of the stairs, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She looked at Sienna, reaching out a trembling hand. Sienna, darling, tell them, call the police. Call. Sienna stepped back. It was a small movement, barely 6 inches, but it was a chasm. She saved us, Mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. And we treated her like garbage. I can't. Sienna turned and fled, disappearing into the crowd of retreating guests. Beatrice was left standing in the center of the ballroom, the lights reflecting off the diamonds she no longer owned. The security team moved in, their footsteps heavy and rhythmic. They didn't touch her, but they formed a circle, a slow-moving perimeter that forced her toward the grand entrance. She walked through the doors she had used to bar her daughter for a decade. Outside, the night air was biting and cold. Her limousine was gone. In its place sat a single, yellow taxi, its engine idling with a low, common rattle. Julian was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't stayed to watch the weeping or the begging. She had delivered the truth and walked away, leaving the vacuum of Beatrice's own making to consume her. As the taxi door opened, Beatrice looked back at the house, the lights beginning to flicker off, room by room, until the great Vance estate was nothing but a dark silhouette against the indifferent stars. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the Vance estate had swung shut behind a single, rattling yellow taxi. The scandal that followed had been a wildfire, consuming the social standing of a dynasty in a matter of weeks. But today, the air in the city felt remarkably still. Julian sat in her new office on the top floor of the Sterling Thorne building, a space defined by floor-to-ceiling glass and the low, comforting hum of high-end servers. The scent here was different from the cloying, floral rot of her childhood home. It smelled of ozone, expensive espresso, and the crisp, neutral scent of fresh rain against the windows. Marcus Thorne stood by the glass, looking out at the skyline. He turned, a thin leather folder in his hand. He looked lighter than he had in years, the tension in his jaw finally replaced by a quiet, professional satisfaction. He set the folder on Julian's desk, a minimalist slab of dark oak that held nothing but a sleek laptop and a single, framed photograph of her father. "The final liquidation is complete," he said, his voice steady. "The debts have been settled, the foundation is fully endowed, and the remaining properties have been sold. The Vance name is officially clean, Julian. For the first time in 30 years, it stands for something other than predatory interest and unearned ego." Julian leaned back, her fingers interlaced. She didn't feel the surge of adrenaline she'd expected. Instead, there was a profound, hollow peace. She had dismantled a kingdom to save its soul. And the others? Sienna is in Dubai, trying to reinvent herself as a luxury consultant, though the engagement numbers suggest the world has a short memory for influencers who lose their backdrop, he replied. Leo's legal troubles regarding the dealership's financing are ongoing. He's currently working as a floor manager for a used car lot in the valley. It's a steep fall for a man who used to think he was too good for anything without a German engine. Julian nodded slowly. She thought of her brother, the man who had once poured wine over her head to impress a crowd, now haggling over the trade-in value of rusted sedans. It was a proportional justice, a quiet grinding of the gears of karma. 10 miles away, in a district where the streetlights hummed with a flickering, sickly yellow light, Beatrice sat at a laminate kitchen table that wobbled whenever she breathed too heavily. The one-bedroom apartment smelled of cheap pine sol and the stale, greasy exhaust from the laundromat downstairs. Her hands, once adorned with diamonds the size of acorns, were now bare and chapped from the cold. She reached for her mug, a chipped ceramic piece she'd bought at a drugstore, and stared at the small television perched on a stack of boxes. On the screen, a news anchor was praising the Julianne Vance Foundation's latest initiative in cybersecurity education. The image of her daughter, looking poised and untouchable in a tailored navy suit, filled the frame. Beatrice felt a familiar, sharp spike of rage, but it had nowhere to go. It was a blunt instrument hitting a void. She had tried to call the office, but Marcus's team had been a wall of ice. She had tried to call Arthur Sterling, but his secretary had informed her that Mr. Sterling did not take calls from former associates. The silence of the apartment was the loudest thing Beatrice had ever heard. There were no maids, no caterers, no sycophants laughing at her cruel jokes. There was only the sound of the refrigerator's labored compressor and the realization that she had spent 50 years building a fortress of vanity, only to find herself locked outside the walls. She took a sip of her coffee, bitter, lukewarm, and cheap, and felt the crushing weight of her own irrelevance. Later that afternoon, Julian drove to the manor one last time. The for sale sign had been removed, replaced by a sold banner. She walked through the empty foyer, her heels clicking against the marble. The grand staircase, once the stage for Beatrice's theatrical entrances, was nothing more than stone and shadow. She climbed to the attic, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. In a corner, tucked behind a discarded trunk, she found it, a small, hand-carved wooden horse. Her father had made it for her before the business and Beatrice had consumed him. She picked it up, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her thumb. She had won. The bullies were gone, the wealth was repurposed, and the truth was undisputed. But as she looked around the empty, cold house, she felt the cost of the victory. She was the last one standing in a graveyard of memories. She had traded a family of monsters for a life of solitude, and while the trade was necessary, the price was her innocence. Julian tucked the wooden horse into her coat pocket and walked back down the stairs. She didn't look back as she stepped out into the sunlight, locking the heavy oak doors behind her. The house was just a building now, and she was finally more than just a Vance. She was herself.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.